Eli Marsh rode with the wind at his back, a familiar pressure that felt more like a part of him than his own shadow. It was a Wyoming wind, full of dust and distance, the kind that could scour a soul clean or drive a person mad. He figured it would do the latter to the woman who had just arrived from Chicago. A niece. He'd heard it from Abernathy at the general store in Crestfall. Old man Voss had left his 300 acres to a city niece named Clara. Eli had known Voss, a man as gnarled and tough as the scrub oak on his land, and he couldn't imagine a world where a woman from a place with paved streets and gas lamps could take root in this soil. He topped the rise that separated his land from the Voss place and saw the cabin, small and solid against the vast, unending sage. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the pale blue sky. He'd expected to find a carriage waiting, trunks being loaded back on. He'd expected tears, or fright, or the brittle anger of a woman defeated by a place that did not care for her comfort. He was certain he would find her packing her bags, ready to sell the land for a song and flee back to civilization. He felt a grim, familiar ache in his chest. It was for the best. This land was no place for delicate things. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Learned it with Eleanor. He nudged his horse, Buck, down the gentle slope. The cabin grew clearer, and with it, the shape of a person near the woodpile. It was her, Clara Voss. She was not packing. She was not crying. She was splitting wood. Eli reined in his horse a dozen yards away and just watched for a moment. She wore a traveling coat, a fine wool thing that must have cost a pretty penny back in Chicago, but the hem was already stained with mud and the shoulders were dark with sweat. It was ruined. She had a round of pine set on the block, and she lifted the axe with a motion that was more grit than grace. It was not the smooth, practiced swing of a man who had done it his whole life, but it was steady, unhurried. She brought the axe down, and the wood gave way with a satisfying crack. She did not pause to admire her work. She simply bent, set the two halves aside, and placed another whole round on the block. He dismounted, the harness leather creaking in the immense quiet. Her back was to him. She must have heard his approach, but she gave no sign. She lifted the axe again. "That's a man's work," Eli said. His voice was rough, unused for most of the day. The axe came down. The wood split. She turned then, pushing a stray strand of brown hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She was not beautiful in the way Eleanor had been, all soft lines and porcelain skin. This woman's face had planes and angles. Her eyes were a clear, steady gray, and they held no fear, only a kind of calm assessment. She looked at him, then at his horse, then back at him. She was, he guessed, near 30. A woman grown. "The wood doesn't seem to know the difference," she replied. Her voice was lower than he expected, and it carried no hint of the city in its cadence. It was just a voice. He walked closer, stopping on the other side of the chopping block. He took in the stack of split wood, modest but growing. He took in the determined set of her jaw. Everything about her was an argument against what he knew to be true. "You won't last a winter," he said. It was not a threat or an insult. He meant it as a statement of fact, a piece of plain-spoken truth offered without malice, like telling a man the creek was running high or that a storm was on its way. She looked at the mountains, their peaks already gathering a dusting of white. Then she looked at the woodpile. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply bent, picked up another round, and settled it on the block. She squared her feet, gripped the handle of the axe, and split it clean in two. The sound echoed in the stillness between them. It was the only answer she gave. What Eli Marsh did not tell her was why he was so certain. He did not tell her about the ghost who walked beside him on this land, the ghost of a woman he had brought from a town not so different from Chicago. A woman who had loved him, but who could not love the place he came from. He did not tell her that every doubt he aimed at Clara was really a wound he still carried from Eleanor, who had withered under this same relentless sky. A fever had taken her in the end, but it was the isolation, the ceaseless wind, and the crushing silence that had broken her spirit first. He had watched it happen, helpless and uncomprehending. He would not watch it happen again. Clara Voss, however, refused to wither. The first month passed, and the pile of split wood grew into a formidable wall against the side of the cabin. Eli saw her from a distance, a small, resolute figure moving with purpose. He saw her mending the stretch of fence that bordered his own property, her hands awkward with the wire stretcher at first, then becoming more sure. He saw her leading her uncle's 2 milk cows out to pasture, her steps measured and calm. She did not move like a city woman. She moved like a woman who had found something that was entirely hers and meant to learn its every secret. His excuses for riding over grew thinner with each visit. The first time, it was a legitimate concern about a shared well. The second, a warning about a mountain lion seen in the high country. The third time, he brought a jar of his own canned peaches, claiming his larder was overflowing. He found her on her knees in her uncle's neglected garden, pulling weeds with a fierce concentration. Her hands were bare, the knuckles chapped and the fingernails lined with dirt. "My mother always said a garden is a sign of faith," she said, looking up at him without preamble. "Faith that the sun will rise and the rain will fall. Most folks out here have more faith in a well-stocked pantry," Tria said, setting the jar on a fence post. "I plan on having both," she answered, and went back to her weeding. He stood there for a moment, feeling large and useless. He had come expecting to find her beaten, to offer a low price for her land and help her on her way. Instead, he found her planting roots. He watched the methodical way she worked, the soil yielding to her efforts. He remembered Eleanor trying to plant roses, crying in frustration when the wind tore the delicate petals from the stems. Clara was planting potatoes and squash. Practical things. Things that last. He left without another word, but he thought about her all the way home. He thought about the quiet competence she carried like a shawl. He thought about the way she never complained, never asked for help, never once looked at him with the pleading helplessness he had come to expect. She was not asking for his approval. She was simply doing the work that needed to be done. He started leaving things. A brace of rabbits on her porch after a morning's hunt. A length of good rope he knew she needed for the well pulley. He never waited for thanks. It was not about thanks. It was something else. A conversation held over a mile of empty land. A few days after he left the rope, he found a neatly mended shirt hanging on his own door, a tear in the sleeve stitched so finely he could barely see the seam. He ran his thumb over the stitches. It was a language he was beginning to understand. The shared quiet between them began to change. When he rode over now, sometimes they would work in silence on opposite sides of a fence line, the snip of her wire cutters and the thud of his post driver creating a kind of rhythm. They spoke of practical things. The price of beef in Cheyenne. The signs of an early winter. The best way to treat a cow for scours. He learned that she was 28, that her uncle had been her mother's brother, and that he had written to her for years about this land, about the freedom in its emptiness. He had left it to her, she explained once, looking not at him but at the horizon, because he said she was the only one in the family who wasn't afraid of being alone. Eli realized, with a jolt that startled him, that he enjoyed her company. He enjoyed the way she listened, her head tilted slightly. He enjoyed the dry wit that surfaced in her rare, brief sentences. One afternoon, he was helping her rehang a heavy barn door, and he grumbled about the shoddy work of the man who had built it. He was probably in a hurry, she said, holding the door steady. Or perhaps he was just a man who didn't plan on staying. He looked at her and saw a flicker of something knowing in her gray eyes. She understood. She understood the difference between passing through and putting down roots. He found himself wanting to tell her things, Not about Eleanor. Not yet. But about the land. About the way the light changed in the autumn, and the names of the wildflowers that grew in the high meadows in spring. He wanted to show her the eagle's nest on the tall bluff, and the place where the creek ran deep enough to swim in summer. These thoughts unsettled him. They felt like a betrayal. He was 40 years old, a man who had loved and lost and settled into a quiet, solitary existence. He had his ranch, his work, his peace. It was a spare life, but it was his. Clara Voss was a disruption, a question he had not thought to ask. The townsfolk in Crestfall had noticed, of course. Nothing went unnoticed in a town that small. When Eli went to Abernathy's for supplies, the storekeeper eyed him over the top of his spectacles. "Here you've been neighborly to Miss Voss," Abernathy said, weighing out a sack of flour. "Just that." "Neighborly," Eli replied, his tone discouraging further comment. "Good. Town looks out for her," Abernathy continued, ignoring the warning in Eli's voice. "She's a fine woman, doing her uncle proud." A woman like that, alone out there, well, it's good she has an honorable man nearby. He paused, then added, his voice softer. "You have a remarkable inability, Eli, to see what is standing right in front of your face." Eli paid for his flour and left. The storekeeper's words followed him, kicking up dust like his horse's hooves. He was not blind. He saw her perfectly well. He saw her strength and her quiet resilience, and the way the setting sun caught the gold in her brown hair. He saw it all, and it terrified him. Because he saw the possibility of it all being ripped away again, of history repeating itself in the cruelest way. He saw a ghost, and he could not bear to create another. So he stayed away. For 2 weeks, he did not ride the fence line near her property. He busied himself with his own chores, telling himself it was for the best. He was protecting her from a future she couldn't comprehend, and he was protecting himself from a pain he knew all too well. He told himself he was being sensible, honorable. He felt like a liar and a coward. The sky began to change. The pale blue of autumn deepened to a hard metallic gray. The wind lost its warmth and gained a sharp, biting edge. The old-timers in town nodded sagely. A big one was coming. Eli felt it in his bones. He laid in extra firewood, checked the seals on his windows, and secured the doors of his barn. And he thought of Clara. He pictured her small cabin, her growing but perhaps not yet sufficient woodpile. He imagined her alone, with only 2 cows and a handful of chickens for company, facing the full, screaming fury of a Wyoming blizzard. He fought the urge for a full day. He told himself she was capable. He told himself she would have prepared. He told himself it was not his place. But as the first flakes of snow began to drift down, thick and wet and heavy, he saddled Buck. Honor be damned. He had to know she was safe. The ride over was a battle. The snow was already coming down so thick he could barely see the horns of his own saddle. The wind howled, a physical force that pushed and pulled at him, trying to tear him from his horse. It was the same wind. The wind Eleanor had hated, the one she said sounded like a woman screaming. To Eli, it just sounded like winter. When he finally reached her property, the world had been reduced to a whirling vortex of white. He could barely make out the shape of the cabin, a dark smudge against the snow. He pushed on, his heart a cold lump of dread in his chest. He half expected to find no smoke from the chimney, the cabin already surrendered to the cold. But the thin gray ribbon was there, fighting against the storm. She was alive. She was warm. He reached the cabin and swung down from the saddle, his legs stiff with cold. "Clara," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. He stumbled to the door and pounded on it. "Clara." There was no answer. A cold fear, sharper than the wind, cut through him. He pushed the door. It was unlatched. He stepped inside, into the warm, quiet space. A fire crackled in the hearth. A pot of something simmered on the stove, smelling of beef and barley. A book lay open on the small table. But the cabin was empty. She was gone. Panic seized him. He backed out of the cabin, shouting her name into the storm again and again. Had she gone out for wood? Had she fallen? The snow was already deep enough to cover a person in minutes. He turned toward the barn, a desperate last hope. The path was almost invisible, but he could just make out the faint indentation of footprints, already filling with new snow. He fought his way through the drifts, the wind trying to rip the breath from his lungs. He reached the barn and shoved the heavy door open. The interior was dim, filled with the warm animal smell of hay and livestock. And there she was. She was on her knees in the hay of a small pen, her back to him. One of her cows lay on its side, exhausted. And nestled against its belly was a tiny, wet, newborn calf. Clara was rubbing the calf vigorously with a piece of burlap, her movements urgent and focused. She was murmuring to it, her voice a low, steady comfort against the rage of the storm outside. He stood in the doorway, the snow swirling in around him, and he just watched her. She had not run from the storm. She had not hidden from it. She had walked out into its heart to bring a new life safely into the world. She had done it alone. He had been so worried about saving her, he had never once considered that she was perfectly capable of saving herself. And everything else, too. She must have felt the cold draft, because she looked over her shoulder. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, her hair plastered to her head. In the dim light of the lantern, he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You're here," she said. It was not a question. "I was worried," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "The calf came early," she explained, turning back to her work. "Mama was having a hard time of it. We're all right now." "We," she said, "we." He closed the barn door, shutting out the storm. The sudden quiet was profound. All he could hear was the soft lowing of the cow, the rustle of the hay, and the sound of his own breathing. He walked over and knelt in the hay beside her. He took a piece of burlap and began to help her dry the calf, their hands brushing in the coarse fabric. They worked in silence for a long time, a shared, simple task that felt more important than anything he had ever done. The little calf, finally dry and warm, gave a weak bleat and struggled to its feet on wobbly legs. It nosed its way toward its mother. Clara sat back on her heels, letting out a long, slow breath. "There now," she whispered. The blizzard raged for 2 days. They were trapped together, a small island of warmth and life in a world of white fury. They passed the time in a comfortable quiet, tending the animals, keeping the fire fed, drinking coffee that was strong and black. The silence was different now. It was not an absence of words, but a presence of understanding. On the second night, with the wind still rattling the window panes, they sat before the fire. The storm had forced a kind of intimacy that a year of fence mending never could. Eli found himself looking at her, really looking at her, and seeing not a problem to be solved or a disaster to be averted, but just Clara. He saw the strength in her hands, now resting loosely in her lap. He saw the intelligence in her clear gray eyes, now watching the flames. He saw a woman who was whole and complete on her own, a woman who did not need him or any man. And he realized, with a clarity that was as sudden and stunning as a lightning strike, that he wanted to be needed by her anyway. "My wife died here," he said, his voice quiet. The words came out of him before he had even decided to speak them. They hung in the warm air between them. Clara did not look at him. She continued to watch the fire. "I'm sorry," she said. "Her name was Eleanor," he went on, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "She was from back east. A town girl. I thought she would love it here. The space, the quiet. I thought my love would be enough to make her love it. He shook his head slowly. But the wind, she said. It got inside her head. The silence was too loud. She tried. For 3 years, she really tried. But this place just wore her down to nothing. When the fever came, she had no fight left in her. He finally looked at Clara. When you arrived, all I could see was her. I saw your nice coat in your city hands, and I made up my mind. I was so sure you would break. I think, he admitted, the truth of it tasting like ash in his mouth. I think I wanted you to break, so I could be right. So it wouldn't have been my fault that Eleanor, he couldn't finish the sentence. She was looking at him now. Her gaze was direct and filled not with pity, but with a deep, unwavering understanding. She had not been competing with the Wyoming wind or the harsh winters. She had been competing with a ghost. I am not her, Eli, she said softly. It was a simple statement of fact. A brave one. It was the axe splitting the log. It was the weeds pulled from the garden. It was the calf born in the storm. It was everything. He felt something inside him, a knot of grief and fear he had carried for years, finally begin to loosen. He saw the truth. He had been the one who was trapped, the one who was withering. He had been so afraid of the past. He had almost missed his future, sitting right here in front of him. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It took me a blizzard to see it clear. All this time, I thought I was watching you to see if you would stay. But I think I was the one who needed a reason to. He took a breath, the air clean and new in his lungs. I would like to stay, Clara. Not just for the storm. I would like to stay as your husband. She was silent for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his. He saw a dozen emotions flicker there, surprise, relief, and something warm and deep that made his heart ache. A small, slow smile touched her lips. Well, she said, her voice laced with that dry humor he had come to love. You certainly took your time getting there. I'm a slow man, he admitted. Yes, she agreed, but steady. Their courtship was as practical and unadorned as they were. There were no flowers or poetry. Instead, there was work. He helped her put up the last of her hay, and she helped him sort his cattle for the drive to Cheyenne. They rode the fence lines together, their horses walking side by side, their conversation easy and comfortable. They talked about the future, about combining their herds, about turning her uncle's fallow fields into acres of winter wheat, about building a life that was sturdy enough to withstand any storm. They were married a month later, on a crisp October day in the small church in Crestfall. Clara wore a simple dress of blue wool, the color of the autumn sky. Eli wore his best suit, which still smelled faintly of cedar and leather. The whole town came. Abernathy stood as Eli's witness, clapping him on the back with a knowing grin. It was a short ceremony, the words simple and solid, a promise not of ease, but of partnership. As they walked out of the church into the bright, clear sunshine, the townspeople cheered. They were no longer just Eli Marsh and the Voss woman. They were the Marshes. It felt right. It felt like coming home. 5 years later, Eli sat on the porch of the house they had built together, a house that stood exactly on the property line, joining the two ranches into one. It was dusk, and the sky was streaked with pink and orange. The air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. Clara sat in the rocker beside him, her hands, no longer soft but strong and capable, busy mending a small tear in their son's trousers. The boy, 4-year-old Thomas, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's steady gray eyes, was chasing fireflies in the yard, his laughter carrying on the evening air. He's got more energy than a spring colt, Eli said, sipping his coffee. He gets it from your side of the family, Clara replied, not looking up from her mending. The Vosses are a calm and sensible people. Eli chuckled. Is that so? I seem to recall a story about a certain Voss who decided to take on a Wyoming winter with nothing but 2 trunks and a stubborn streak. That wasn't stubbornness, she corrected him smoothly. That was faith, and a good axe. She bit off the thread and held up the trousers for inspection. The mend was nearly invisible. Besides, she added, her eyes twinkling, I heard there was a slow, steady neighbor nearby who left rabbits on the porch. I figured I was in good hands. He reached over and covered her hand with his own. Her skin was warm, familiar. He looked at her, at his son, at the vast and beautiful land that stretched out before them, no longer empty, but full of life and work and a quiet, unshakable love. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood tree by the porch. It was the same wind, but it no longer sounded like a woman screaming. It sounded like a promise. It sounded like peace. That's the thing about proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's not an argument at all. Sometimes it's just the quiet, steady act of becoming what you were always meant to be, right where you were meant to be. It's the sound of an axe splitting wood, of a garden being planted, of a life being built, piece by patient piece. It's a language of action, not words, a testament to the simple truth that the deepest roots grow not in the easiest soil, but in the soil you choose to call your own. Thank you for riding with me today. I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding.